So the first book that we're going to talk about today is called When Stars Are Scattered, and the author of this book is Victoria Jamieson and Omar Mohamed. Victoria Jamieson is the author of the most amazing graphic novel, Roller Girl. And Victoria Jamieson, actually interviewed Omar Mohamed so that she could write his life story, the story of his life growing up as a child. She interviewed him to tell this story. And if you couldn't tell from Roller Girl being something else that the author has written, this is a graphic novel. And so we don't need to convince you to read a graphic novel. You gravitate toward them pretty darn well on your own. You know how good it is to see the pictures while you're reading. You don't need me to tell you anything about that. The story that you would read if you chose When Stars Are Scattered is the story of Omar, one of the other authors, and his younger brother Hassan. And it's the story about how they grew up in Somalia, but they actually spent a large portion of their childhood at a refugee camp. And if you don't know what a refugee is someone who's been forced to leave their home country. They're forced to leave sometimes by walking, sometimes by fleeing, sometimes by airplane, but they are forced to leave their home country to go somewhere else because of war or some sort of big natural disaster. They can't live in their home country and they have to go somewhere else. And so these boys, Omar and Mohamed, spent a lot of their childhood in a refugee camp. And the story is about themselves growing up together, who they rely on, how they don't have their family with them anymore. It's just the two of them. It's about how they make progress. It's about how they survive. It's about how they learn to thrive all together in this refugee camp that they live in for years. It's wonderful. It's delightful. And I hope that you read it at some point, even if you don't read it during our Lit Circle. So the next book that I want to talk to you about today is called Under the Mesquite by Guadalupe Garcia Macal. And interestingly, this book is written as a book in verse, which means that it's a collection of poems that work together to tell the story, which is always nice because it means that there's fewer words on the page. You can help really focus and narrow in on what you're reading. But what's interesting about this book, one of the things, is that this book has 16,715 words in it, which means that it's actually shorter than the graphic novel When Stars Are Scattered. So graphic novel has 27,000 words and this one has 16,000. So interestingly, this book is actually a shorter read than the graphic novel, but it has words and no pictures. So it's a different choice. And I hope some of us will choose this. What's really appealing about Under the Mesquite to me is that some of the words are in Spanish. And so the text is beautifully written in English, but because the main character of this book, Lupita, now I'm nervous, that's not her name, hold on. It is her name. Because the main character, Lupita, is a Latinx character, most of the words are in English, but it's peppered in throughout the book with her native language, the language her family speaks, which is Spanish. And so as you're reading, you can use context clues to figure out what she's talking about because she does a nice job of embedding hints about what that could be in the text. But there's also a glossary at the back, so if you really don't know what tabla means, you can go look at the back to get the definition. So it supports you as you're reading. It can be a great book to read if you're also Spanish speaking because you might be feeling like it's a more authentic experience that uses some of your skills as a person who speaks more than one language. It can also be fun if you're not a Latinx student, if you're not a Spanish speaking student, it can be fun because it pushes you in a different way. And as we learned from our article about empathy, it can help you understand someone else's lived experience. So there's lots of Spanish. It's a book in verse. It's nice and simple. It's not too long. It wouldn't take you terribly long to do the reading. And the book is semi-autobiographical. So the author, Guadalupe Garcia Macal, she's writing about her own life, but it's not a true story because some of the details she sort of tinkers with or edits or changes to make them a little bit better of a story. So it's based on her life, but isn't a totally true recounting of what happened. I loved Under the Mesquite, and I think that you could love it too. Page through and see if it's for you. I probably shouldn't be saying this, but the next 3 books are actually my absolute favorites. They're some of my favorite books that I've read recently. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the next most difficult. It's called Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. And the author, Jacqueline Woodson, is writing a memoir about her own life. And so a memoir is within the nonfiction genre, which means that it's true. But a memoir is not the same as an autobiography. In an autobiography, you tell everything fact, 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 fact. But in a memoir, you can kind of mess with a few of the details because she's telling a lot of this story from her childhood, and she doesn't always remember what happened when she was 4. And so she's using the memories of her grandparents and her mom and her brothers to help her piece together what her childhood was like. So it's a nonfiction text called a memoir because some of the details are true, but they might be like slightly off or slightly adapted because she didn't totally remember them herself. Now this book, just like Under the Mesquite, is written in verse, which means that it's a book that is a compilation of different poems, which means that it's also a really great book for people who get overwhelmed by lots of words on the page. Highly recommend. Jacqueline Woodson is writing about her own life, so the main character's name is Jackie. And Jackie grows up during the Civil Rights era in the 1950s and 60s right here in the United States. And so she is a young black girl growing up in the South, which is complex because there were a lot of laws in place during the Civil Rights era that they were trying to change regarding segregation and things like that. And so if you are someone who read Watson's Go to Birmingham last year and loved it, this might be a really nice next book for you because it takes place during the same period of time, but it takes place, of course, with totally different characters. So it's like a nice next step. The book has 30,000 words, which is about 15,000 more than Under the Mesquite, so it's like doubly as big. But there's also an audiobook for this one, so you could read the paper book and listen to the audiobook at the same time to support your comprehension and to help keep you focused. I love Jacqueline Woodson's text. It's magical. The way that she tells stories draws you right in, and her perspective and voice is just so refreshing. It is a great book to read, and I hope that you choose it. Okay. Another real favorite, kids, The List by Patricia Ford. This book is outstanding. It falls within the dystopian genre. And of course, dystopian books are when it's sort of like the end of the world or something has happened in the world that makes it drastically different from the world we're living in now. So it's like our world, but not our world. In The List, what happens is it's sort of like near future. So it's like what we're living in now, but just a little bit ahead, a couple years, maybe a decade ahead of us. And in the world where the characters live in The List, the people in power have decided to limit the number of words that everyone can speak. And that list of words that they can approve and use is called The List. So the people in power, the government, has decided that people can only use 500 words ever. Nothing on the list other than 500 words. Think about how many words we use on an average day and think it's probably more than 500 because when we go to science, we use science-specific words. When we go to language arts, we use language arts specific. In math, something else. In cooking, different words and vocabulary come up. But this book has limited 500 words for every person in their country to speak, and only those. And they've enacted really strict, disturbing punishments for people who say words that are no longer on the list. And that goes for children, for babies, for everyone who lives in this world. The punishments are strict as the government tries to crack down and control the people who live in this land. And there's one character called the Wordsmith, who is our main character or our narrator for this story, named Letta. And her job as the wordsmith is that she is allowed to keep a record of all the words. Not just the 500 on the list, but every word that humanity has ever come up with, created, and used throughout time. So she is a collector of words that are now forbidden to be spoken by other people. And what the conflict is that Letta has been asked by the government or the people in charge. She's been asked to shorten the list because they are trying to control the people more and more and more. And so the list goes from 500 to 450 to 400, and they just keep limiting the amount of words that people can speak as a way to gain control over the masses of people. It is outstanding. It is weird. It is strange. It is great for people who enjoy dystopian, right? Dystopians like Maze Runner, Hunger Games. It's people who love reading about worlds that are like ours with a twist, sort of an end of the world kind of twist. It's longer than the other books I've talked about so far. It has 75,000 words, which you can see is kind of a long book. You're going to have 6 weeks to do this reading in class. 6 weeks is a month and a half. So you want to choose a book that you are capable of reading in that amount of time. Most of us are going to be capable of reading a book that is this long because it's a 6-week period of time. But page through and see if this is the right book for you. The List by Patricia Ford. It's Trevor Noah. Born a Crime is the last book I'm going to be talking about. And it is outstanding. It's one of the best things I've read. And the first chapter is even like worth reading right now here in this space. Because Trevor Noah, he runs one of the late night comedy shows. I don't stay up that late, but he's on The Daily Show. He's a comedian, and so his book is hysterical. His book is filled with his comedic style, but it's also very challenging. So it's the spiciest book that is on offer in this Lit Circle. I'm going to read you the first line because it is incredibly sad, but also incredibly funny the way that he writes. So the first chapter says, "Run." And the first line of the book starts, "I was 9 years old when my mother threw me out of a moving vehicle. It happened on a Sunday. I know it was on a Sunday because we were coming home from church, and every Sunday in my childhood meant church. We never missed church. My mother was and still is a deeply religious woman." Now, that opening line is outstanding. It's a hook, right? I was 9 years old when my mother threw me out of a moving car. It's funny. It's also sad, and you have to keep reading to find out what happens next. Trevor Noah grew up in South Africa during the period of history called the apartheid, which is when South Africa was incredibly segregated between the people who lived in South Africa that were white and the people who lived in South Africa that were black. So there were different places you were allowed to live, places you were allowed to work. The rules were different for different groups of people. And Trevor Noah grew up sort of in the mixed into this sort of conflict because his mother was black, but his father was white. And that was really not allowed during that time. You were not allowed to have a relationship inter-race. So you couldn't have a relationship with someone who didn't have the same skin color as you. It was banned in South Africa during the time. And so he grew up in this world where he wasn't even supposed to exist. And he had to live sort of in secret, pretending he was one thing and not another. And it is definitely sort of a dark book, because of what he's lived through can be traumatic. He definitely has mentions of really mature topics, like if you shy away from things that might be heavy or have some really deep emotional content. He talks about abuse. He talks about alcoholism in his family. He talks about personal tragedy. He talks about race and racism very explicitly. And so if that is a book that is like just sounding like too much for you, or maybe that the content might be a little off-putting to you, this is not the right book for you. This is the spiciest, the hardest book that's on offer. It has technically fewer words than The List, so it's shorter, but the content is more mature, which makes it more difficult. There's no audiobook for this book, the Young Readers Edition, so you'd be on your own. I did also forget to mention that The List has an audiobook. If that's a game changer for you, it exists. Okay, I can't wait to see which one you pick. So if you haven't done it yet, pick up some books at your table and page through and see which is going to be the just right fit for you. You've got 6 weeks to read these books. Think about what book you'd want to read for 6 weeks. And that might mean, even though you love graphic novels, you might not want to read the same book for 6 weeks if you can finish it in 3 days. So make the choice that's right for you. Okay, can't wait to see you.